Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, we shall talk about chapter 4, which is about population dynamics. We had previously defined the term population, and which is a group of same species living together like this. So you can study the environment at an individual level, at a population level, a community level, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere level. Today's focus should be the population. So if you look at a picture like this, this is a community of various different organisms, whereas an individual species would be a population within that community. This statement is intriguing, and I read this a long time ago, and it's one of those fascinating statements that had intrigued me even when I was a high school student. Statements like this. This is from your textbook, at least the current version. Every organism you can think of is a member of a population. So every organism you can think of is a member of a population, page 90. It intrigues me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something like this. We read in the Quran, there is not an animal that lives on the earth, nor a being that flies on its wings, but forms part of communities like you. Nothing have you omitted from the book, and they all shall be gathered to their Lord in the end. I find such statements so beautiful. I do not try to use science to justify religion, because religion does not need any help in that regards, but it is just a very beautiful statement. Now, how do we study population, and what constitutes a healthy population, of whether it be population of bacteria or of rabbits or deer or humans, at least from a scientific point of view? A healthy population grows and dies at a relatively steady pace. In other words, there are no dramatic, rapid fluctuations in the population. It grows and dies at a relatively steady pace. One way to study population is to introduce those organisms in a particular environment, in a controlled environment, with resources, and observe their growth. So one way to study, for example, bacteria, which we do to this day, is to introduce them to a petri dish. A petri dish is basically a plastic container that has yummy food for the bacteria, and mostly sugar and type jello over here. So a petri dish is basically a container of food for the bacteria, and if you swap some bacteria over there, and voila, after a given time, colonies of bacteria grow. So one way to study bacteria, for example, is like this, in a controlled fashion. And this is very helpful because it helps us understand the bacteria as a pathogen, and helps us study it so that in case it causes disease, that we might be able to better fight such diseases. That's one way to study organisms, to introduce them to an environment and in a controlled fashion, and to study what happens to them. You can't always do that. For example, you can't introduce an elk to a petri dish. So how do you study such organisms? Well, for these elks, at least you can put the radio collars on them and study, for example, their migratory patterns, their population, because if next year you see an elk that does not have a collar, that means that's a new elk, and you can put a collar in. So in this way, for example, you have studied Yellowstone's elk population, and you can see the fluctuations in the populations. So there are various different imaginative ways scientists have devised to study living things or populations in their natural habitat. This is an interesting graphic picture over here. This suggests that the population of two different species may be linked or intertwined. In other words, the fate of one organism is dependent on the population, the fate of a different species. Here, for example, is moose and the wolf. The wolf feeds on the moose, okay, and as the moose population increases over here slowly, okay, and that's very good for the wolves, because now they can hunt. So after they hunt, okay, their population starts to go because they have lots of food. But when the wolves population starts to increase because they're feeding on the moose, their population starts to decrease, right? But when there's moose population starts to decrease, now the wolves don't have enough to eat, right? So their population declines rapidly, and when they have declined to a substantial amount. The moose are now free. There's less predators for them, and the moose population again tries to grow. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon where the population of both of these organisms, the moose and the wolf, is controlled by each other. If there are too many moose, the wolves will hunt them down, and if there are once the wolf hunt down the moose, then the lack of scarcity of food for them will decline in their own population. So here's two populations that are linked to each other. In fact, predators like wolves, okay, control the population of the prey. But then the prey population, in effect, also controls the population of the predator, because they're both dependent on each other in that way. So predator-prey relationship, they both control each other, and if one is missing, they both can potentially suffer. Population growth is initially exponential. If you let population grow, in other words, if the resources are not limited, for example, here, if you have like flies, for example, if flies could have all the food and no predators, they would take over the world. So population naturally, if there were no limitations, if there were no limiting factors, would grow exponentially. Okay, they don't grow linearly. So population growth is exponential if the resources are not restricted, if there are no limiting factors. Okay, an example here is the bees. However, invariably there are limiting factors, thankfully, otherwise we would have bees flying all over the place. Limiting factors determine what's called a carrying capacity. Okay, so if what one observes is the population grows rapidly initially, but then it levels off and plateaus to a certain level and varying minutely in that range. So this plateau level, that's called the carrying capacity of that environment. Okay, if there were no limiting factors, the growth would be exponential. Okay. And the number carrying capacity is defined as the number of organisms of a species an environment is able to support indefinitely. In other words, if the organism survives at this population level, that population is supported by the environment indefinitely, unless, of course, a new limiting factor occurs. So this is a normal pattern of growth of populations, which eventually tapers off. If, for example, a population grows exponentially without limiting factors, if they run out of resources, right? For example, if you have a new species and they have no competition, they're just able to eat everybody, right? They will eventually eat everything. After they have eaten everything, they have no food, right? Or there are too many of them. So if the growth is exponential and all of a sudden, and it will be all of a sudden, because one day there will be not a single blade of grass, for example, or not a little berry left on a tree. When there's finally no food left, the whole population will crash and they'll starve to death like this, okay? Because, it's not like they can plan, okay, well, it looks like food is running out, guys, okay, don't munch on that grass too much. So it's very important to understand exponential growth when it occurs. Exponential growth can occur initially, but it's the limiting factors that taper off the population. If there are no limiting factors, the population can crash when they run out of food or something like that. So what are the limiting factors that stabilize population? Notice I said stabilize population, okay? If they're missing, that population will crash eventually, but if they are there, they can stabilize the population. The limiting factors include availability of food, predators, diseases, and lack of space. Okay, if there's natural predators, as we talked about the wolf in the moose story, it will maintain certain population. If there are no predators, it's actually can be very bad for the animal overall in the long run. So limiting factors include food availability, predators, diseases. Okay, because diseases can be can affect if the population increases because of the increased density and the lack of space. So these are all some examples of limiting factors. Okay. So initially, as I stated, population growth can be exponential if a new population arises, and then eventually that population reaches a carrying capacity equilibrium. Now, in terms of organisms, there are two types of organisms. Okay, there are two types of organisms. All right. Now, the best example of these two, comparison example, is the mosquito, okay, and the elephant, okay, in terms of their life cycle, because mosquito, okay, they don't have, or like a bee or whatever, they have a very short life. They have to complete their whole life cycle in a very short period of time, whereas elephants, they have a very long life. Okay, so different species have what's called different reproductive patterns, which is important because that affects population dynamics. Okay, mosquitoes, for example, have a rapid life history. In other words, from the time they're born to time they're toddlers, to time they're teenagers and they come to their reproductive age, and then they marry and die. The whole cycle is very short. Okay, so mosquitoes have a very rapid life history pattern. Okay, and you can understand that in any living thing that has a very rapid life history pattern, they're going to be small in size, because how are they going to grow big if they don't have time to grow big, right? So they have the rapid life history pattern. Organisms have tend to have small size. They mature fast, right? From the time they're born to the time they're in reproductive ages is quick, and they also reproduce early, because they're all running out of time, so to speak, and they have a short lifespan. So one type of organisms is characterized by a very rapid life history pattern, and an example would be a mosquito. Okay. On the other hand, there are living things who have very slow life history pattern. Okay, and they when they're born, they take a long time to mature, etc. Now, elephants tend to living things that occur in that have a slow life history pattern. You tend to find them in stable environments. They need stable environments, okay, to thrive. Okay, mosquitoes don't need to have stable environment, because they're just looking for one particular type of season, very short period of time, right? They don't really care what happens outside of that time, right? So the environment could be extremely labile, it could be extremely unstable, but the mosquito still will thrive in this very short period of time that they need, that's essential for their life cycle to occur. So living things that have a rapid life history pattern tend to occur in unstable environments, whereas living things like elephants, which have slow life history pattern, tend to occur in more stable environments. Okay. Also, they tend to have fewer young, because the young needs a lot of care, because they have their maturation process is slowed down, so they have a fewer young, and they tend to take care of their youngs, etc. So elephants, bears, whales, humans, and trees are examples of living things that have slow life history pattern. Now, this chapter is all about population dynamics, what happens to population. Some of the comments that we have already made is this. Number one, how do we study living things? One was to introduce them in a petri dish type style into a controlled environment and see what happens to the example. Then we talked about how a species in an environment are interdependent. What population of one affects the population of the other. That was the moose and the wolf example, right? And then we suggested that there are different type of life history patterns. Some have very rapid life cycle, like the mosquito, and some have very slow life cycle, like the elephant. So this chapter is all about how populations, the characteristics of population in a particular environment. So we should continue with some other of those population characteristics or population dynamics. Okay. one of the things that you observe about population is how they are dispersed in an environment. Okay, for example, you'll see that a certain population is kind of clumped over in certain area. Okay, they're kind of like clumped over in certain area, and like like a herd of deers, and then there's not that many over here. Okay, or like wolves. You see them all together, packed together, and then there are populations that are pretty uniformly distributed, right? And then there are populations that are randomly distributed. Okay, randomly distributed. Then the question becomes, why? What causes such patterns to occur? How come certain populations of living things behave like this, and some behave like this, and some behave like this? Okay, and whatever causes them to behave like this, you must also understand this affects the density of the population. In this case, this population that tends to clump will be more dense, and this population would be less, and this population would be less, like that. So population dispersion, or spread of the population, for whatever reason it is that occurs like in these patterns, affects how dense that population is going to be. So now, why does this happen? For example, these like fishes or minnows, whatever, they tend to be like clumped pattern over here, and these penguins, they're kind of evenly distributed in the area that they are. And then these are trees of different species of trees. Like these are, I'm trying to, in my mind's eye, find species of, same species of trees. These are kind of like randomly distributed. Okay, randomly distributed patterns. So this picture here tries to explain why the populations disperse as they do. In clumped patterns, I'm kind of going backwards almost like that. Okay, there is a certain attraction between individuals, or attraction of individuals to a common resource. Okay, so they band together, obviously, because it's helpful for them for survival purposes and whatnot. Okay, individuals live in areas of high local abundance separated by areas low, so they're clumped. Okay, for example, wolves travel in pack because that's how they hunt, because they're clumped because it's advantageous for their survival. Okay, advantageous for their survival. So they have common resources, they cooperate with each other. Okay, the pattern is regular, where the individuals are competing with each other in an environment. Okay, and if there's depletion of resources, so if everybody's fighting against everybody, distance is going to be equal, because they're all in competition with one another. Okay, they're not going to be cooperative and being one gang over here, one gang over here. They're not smart enough to do that, I guess. Okay, and finally, if they're random, there are neutral interactions between individuals, and presence of one has no effect on presence or lack thereof of the other of the same species. So if there are neutral interactions between individuals of the same population, they tend to be randomly dispersed. If there are antagonistic interactions between individuals, they tend to have very regularly dispersed. And if there's a cooperative interaction, or if there's attraction between individuals, it's probably better to say cooperative interactions, then they tend to be clumped. So this explains why populations are so dispersed. Okay, and this, as we have said, affects population density. Okay, so thus far, this is what we have discussed. We have discussed population dynamics. We have described what a healthy population is, and that is the population grows and dies in a steady pace. And we briefly commented on how populations are studied by introducing organisms into a controlled environment or by tracking them. And then we suggested how populations grow. Populations grow exponentially if they're allowed to. Populations do not grow linearly. If there are limiting factors, and nearly always are, the populations tend to reach a carrying capacity, which is dependent on the limiting factors. Okay. And carrying capacity is defined as the number of organisms an environment is able to support indefinitely, unless there are obviously changes in the environment. We have also suggested that species have different reproductive patterns. Okay, there's species with a rapid life history pattern like mosquitoes, And then there are species with slow life history patterns, which require a stable environment. They have fewer, these organisms with slow life history patterns, they have fewer offspring, and they invest more time in their offspring, just like elephants or people, and they slow maturation, etc. So there are different reproductive patterns, and we have suggested the population density patterns impacts population dispersion patterns impacts the density of living things in that area. And then we talked about three dispersion patterns, such as clumped and random and uniform. And these are important to appreciate because these affect how the population is going to respond to stress, etc. Okay. After a brief pause, inshallah, I'll continue from here. Until next time, assalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi.